Hey guys, back for another episode to analyze the various types of fixtures we commonly use as grow lights. If you still haven't seen it, check it out a couple of episodes ago where we went over this data here, going over the consumption, the temperature output, and the light intensity of compact fluorescent, LED, hypersodium, and metal halide that I use in my micro grow. So as I was saying last time, intensity is great and all, and this is actually a very powerful tool just using your cell phone lux meter. But as far as the plants are concerned, there's something even more important that we consider than the amount of light, and that is the quality of the light, the spectrum, what wavelength or energy the light is coming to the plants, the wavelength of the photons. So as I was saying last time, I don't have a PAR meter that could spit out a micromole per second per meter square, whatever value, which would be useful. But I do actually have access to a UV-vis and IR spectrometer. And if you're interested in the details of that, just let me know in the comments and I can fill you in on that. But basically, all it is a detector that measures light intensity at individual wavelengths. And the one I'm using is going from 200 nanometers to about 1200 nanometers detection. So that's from UVB or UVC to the mid-IR range, or near IR kind of area. And so let's take a look at the results of measuring these exact fixtures. I'm not looking up these fixtures. I actually measured them for these four lights. So first we have the HPS, which is the one I commonly use to grow. And, I kind of always thought nice light, especially for flowering, should have lots of red intensity. So quickly, what we got here is the wavelength on the x-axis, intensity on the y. You can see I added a color scale for you guys here, going from purple to red. And then we have UV and IR here, obviously. And the intensity here is always going to be normalized. So in other words, the peak position here is equal to 100% or 1. So just keep that in mind. It is possible to use this spectrometer to get very accurate intensity measurements relative to distance and area, but I don't have it set up for that, and I'm not going to do that. It's just not something I'm really interested in. Anyway, well, you can see the kind of hallmark of these HID lights is that this HPS has a very sharp, very narrow peak at around, 580, 590 or so. I have the actual data. If you want details of that, let me know in the comments, and I can look up what actual values. Just let me know specifics of what you're interested in. And then we have some other peaks around that dotted around, but not much really. Very low baseline and just a couple of these intense peaks. Not nearly as much red as I would expect from an HPS. So if we compare that to the metal halide now, which is in blue here, you can see that there is a significant difference. And in many ways, the metal halide has much more red intensity, has the same exact peak as the HPS. Again, remember they're normalized, so if you're looking at the real intensity, this peak of the HPS might be higher. But if they were at the same lumen value, then they should look just like this. And you can see a lot more peaks, again, very sharp, but also a good bit of baseline intensity throughout the visible spectrum. Again, extending a bit further to the red than the HPS, and quite a lot more into the blue, violet, and a little bit of UV even looks like there. So quite surprising there, You always think of HPS as kind of the more flowering red bulb, and metal halide obviously does have a lot more blue intensity, but it's just much broader overall. It does have these green intensities that you might consider being wasted, you know, as kind of classical model that blue light and red light are much more efficiently utilized by the plant. So, you know, there's that to consider. And then the third common one we see, which is the compact fluorescent here in black. And they're all overlaid, so they might be a bit difficult to see. But again, it's the same story. We have this very large peak as our main intensity. Has this bit of a double peak here and a little bit of scattered stuff around. I would say it's a broader spectrum than HPS, but not as broad as the metal halide. So there you go. So you can pause it or ask me for details if you want to know anything specific. So as we were saying, the green light, you know, people classically thought that this wasn't being utilized at all really by plants, and it's just the blue and the red. And so what we really need to do is compare to something these spectra of the emission of these bulbs. And what people classically do is compare it to the PAR, which is the photosynthetic active radiation, or photosynthetically active radiation. In other words, what parts of the electromagnetic spectrum can the plant utilize? What wavelengths or what energies? So people commonly reference this paper here, which is the 72 publication by McCree. And this is the most commonly one you'll see people reference. People did obviously work on this before McCree in 72. In many ways, what he's doing here is responding to the assumptions made in those previous papers. And obviously, a ton of work has been done since then. And let's see, if we just look at the abstract here, what does he say? So he's measuring the amount of CO2 that leaves of different species of plants emit when they're subjected to different wavelengths of light, going from 350 to 750 nanometers. And he has all of these different variables that he's testing in relation to that. So the type of light, the intensity, the angle at which the light goes towards the leaf from the bottom or from the top, CO2 content, all sorts of stuff. So anyway, he says for all the species and the conditions tested, the quantum yield curve had two broad maxima, so two peaks, one at 620 and one at 440. So we're looking at stuff here and stuff here. So mostly missing in these particular lights. With a shoulder at 670. So, and it also says the average height of the blue peak was 70% of that of the red peak. Again, this kind of, you guys have probably seen a PAR spectrum where there's a peak at the red and a peak in the blue, and the blue one's slightly lower in intensity. And he says that, you know, some of that varied where that cutoff, that drop off in the blue was relative to conditions, directional illuminations. But as he says, their differences are negligible. Anyway, so let's just take a quick look at how he did this. Again, he was subjecting these plants to different conditions. And one of the assumptions he's working on here, so you probably can't see that, is whether the action spectrum between, or in the visible range between 400 and 700 is flat. Whether if the plant is actually responding to just the quantum, then it should just respond to all of them equally. And there's, of course, limitations to this study, the way he did it, and, you know, absorbing CO2 as a product of photosynthesis. Anyway, so here is the list of species that he used. So yeah, here's kind of some of the conditions and the radiance. So I looked this up, and this actually quite small value in micromole, quite a lot less than what would be considered normal today. So he was kind of under illuminating them. Here's all the stuff he was feeding them and the concentrations. Continue there. So he was measuring differences in the CO2 concentrations basically, and that's the result he is presenting. And so he's calculating several things here. So first of all, he's measuring an absorption or absorptance, as they say here. By the way, another antiquated thing in this paper is they're using units of micro-Einsteins. So an Einstein is the energy of a mole of photons. And a mole is, remember, a counter, so Avogadro's number of something. Anyway, absorption of the leaves. He's then measuring this action value where he's comparing the two different CO2 values that he measures relative to the intensity. And then he's measuring this quantum yield value by comparing the action and the absorbance. So he's basically taking account what the leaf absorbs into the quantum yield. Okay, so there's kind of that general shape that we're used to seeing. So here's all the different conditions that he tested, adding white light. The direction, leaf variables. So here's an absorption plot you can see here, and this has kind of classic shape where you have this dip at 550, so right at the green. So as you can see, it's not what people thought beforehand where it was just a complete dropout at the green area. The drop actually is only, 15% or so relative to the absorption in the blue or the red peak. So he's using UV here as a condition, age of the plants, so lots of different variable species. Okay, so here's the actual raw data. If you don't have access to it, maybe you want to use this. So there's the quantum yield. Those are for the indoor plants, and these are for the field plants. And finally, the relative action. And so this is the spectrum I actually used. So I inputted this value, so you can see he was going in steps of 25 degrees for his monochronometer. Mine goes in steps of 0.2 nanometers or something like that. It's very accurate, actually. As you can see here, we're getting very high resolutions of all of these tiny peaks. Anyway, so I'm using the mean. So for all of the indoor plants, so this data set right here is what I'm using to compare as my PAR. And he goes into kind of discussing the difference and what he would kind of expect the active or the quantum yield to look like if it was an ideal measure of the activity of the plant. So here's the absorption, there's absorptance. Okay, so here's the kind of final values graph summed up for the quantum yield, the action, and the absorptance. Again, this one is just taking the absorptance accounts into here. That's why you can see the blue is kind of elevated, because blue light, high energy, is very efficient. So this is the one I'm using right now. I'm not even going to get into details of this one versus this one, why one's more effective than the other when comparing different light bulbs. But anyway, you can see he's also comparing to previous publications and getting kind of similar trend. Okay, so and here's the conclusions. So he says the same basic shape was accounted for all the plants and for all the conditions tested. So in other words, he's getting good repeatability across the plants. And we can also say, even though cannabis isn't in the study, these results probably apply to it as well. So response in the UV and the blue depended on the variables he tested, and he is attributing that possibly to non-chloroplastic materials, sort of the carotenoids that have different absorption. So he says neither the action or the quantum yield can be said to be flat throughout the visible region. So this is something he was trying to misprove. So the only conclusion he can make is that neither of them is a perfect measure of the PAR, and both, as a result, will overestimate the effect of blue light relative to red. The wording of this isn't very clear exactly what he means by that. And then he says that the size of the arrow will depend on the light source. And by the way, he's using a white fluorescent supplemented with an incandescent light. Again, at a very relatively low intensity. And then, of course, he mentions some of his future work here. There's the references. Anyway, so directly from that, I went ahead and plotted the PAR. You can see that here. So he's going in 25 nanometer steps from 350 to 750. And so I have it smoothed out here in between. And I also estimated data points at 325, 300, and 775 and 800, assuming this kind of Gaussian decay. And I think it's fairly appropriate assumption. But again, these 4 data points are not in the actual paper. But anyways, you can see when we compare it to what the plant actually uses, again, the metal halide does have a bit of blue here, but it's lacking a lot in the red. So, the question we got to ask ourselves, is there something better than these HID or the fluorescent lights that can help us get a more broader spectrum? So in other words, we need something that has nice broad peaks. And you can probably tell what I'm alluding to here if you've seen the spectrum of these other types of lights. And you know that we have exactly that in LEDs. And so here's our cheap Chinese floodlight. So this is a 50 watt warm white. So that's going to be significant coming up here when we analyze the different types of LED arrays compared to the metal halide. And you can see the emission of the white LED has this really broad peak, this really broad band centered around 580 or so. But it's got a nice tail extending down. It could be shifted a little more to match our PAR. And then it also has another smaller, but also broad peak in the blue. You can see the relative intensity is also kind of getting close to where we want our match red to blue. It's not quite there, but we'll try to improve on this coming up in the future here. So, that's a good way to look at it here with the PAR, but an even better way is to go ahead and plot it on a logarithmic scale for the intensity. And what that's going to do is basically magnify the detail of the lower percentages. And so when we do that, this is what we get. Again, we're on the log scale here. For reference, I put dashed lines where it's 1%, 10%, and obviously up here at the peak is 100%. And you can see that really kind of magnifies this intensity down here. That's very low intensity. All of this is below 1% relative intensity, and this is 1 to 10%. But what's really interesting is that the metal halide, you can see how far actually into the UVA that this goes. It has quite a sharp edge here, but it goes quite far out to, I don't know, 360 or so, but it's low intensity. You know, this peak here is, you know, getting to 2 or 3%, and then only here is it at 10% at about 420 or so. And again, you can see that the LED has a peak around 450, and this red one or yellow one is around 580. And also you can see the metal halide, how far it actually does extend out into the IR and into deep red. And you know, these wavelengths here that are outside of kind of the PAR region, the plant can utilize them, and you know, the 720 wavelengths are used to trigger flowering in cannabis. And so you're not necessarily going to need large intensities of that. So having just some here might be enough. But anyway, there's something for you to take a look at in detail if you wish. And of course, this video is going to get super long. And so here's comparing the metal halide to the HPS, and you can see that significantly less intensity is in both of these regions, and in the middle here as well. The one kind of big peak it has here at 600 is the only thing HPS really has going for it. But again, these aren't grow lights, these are just regular lights, so there might be HPS out there to look better. By the way, if you're ever comparing or looking up lights online and you're seeing manufacturers present them and you're wondering, oh, well, I usually looks like this, not like this. I'm not entirely sure what they're doing, if they're kind of fudging the data here and not being entirely honest that they're plotting it in log scale, or if the grow lights are actually producing this much broader intensity, similar to what this would look like, but in linear scale. I really don't know. If you want to send me a light, I'll measure it for you. And finally, comparing the metal halide to the compact fluoro. Again, you can see we have some of these nice peaks over in the short wavelength and some in the high wavelength. Bit broader than the HPS, but not as good as the metal halide. And that's the real kind of surprising conclusion out of this, for me at least, is how broad this metal halide actually turned out to be. And there they all three together. Okay, so, and finally the LED. Alright, so that's what I got for the spectra, guys, here. Let me know what you think. If any comments, suggestions, questions. So coming up, we're going to go ahead and swap out this 50 watt warm white that came stock with this fixture for a little bit of a upgrade. It's not going to be an expensive like Cree or Vera or anything like that. It's going to be a cheaper option. But we'll see if we can soup up our little LED fixture here and see if we can play around with the spectrum here, see if we can fine tune it a little bit better relative to the PAR. So thanks for watching. Hit the thumbs up button if you like these type of data-driven videos. And we'll see you guys in the next one.